Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. Some quick bookkeeping real quick. This is the finale of our second season of Breakthrough Dialogues. After this, we'll be taking a little time off, but we'll be launching our third season not too long from now, so keep an eye on your podcast platforms. For this episode, I spoke with Stephanie Lepp, who we thought would be the perfect person to end our second season with. Stephanie is an artist and producer who hosts the excellent podcast Reckonings, a show about how we change our hearts and minds. Stephanie interviews people who have shifted their thinking or completely flipped their positions on subjects. Her guests have included former climate deniers, a former religious fundamentalist, and many more. Even before I'd listened to Stephanie's episodes on climate change, I knew I'd want to have her on this show because of the theme of her show. We think a lot about changing our minds here at Breakthrough. As Stephanie and I get into, it's even a question we ask all of our job applicants. Obviously, we don't want to maximize mind changing. That would suggest a pretty unclear worldview and set of principles. But the ability to change your mind, to understand what happened and why it did, strikes us as a pretty important experience. It says a lot about how a person thinks, about the ability of different ideologies and ideas to create productive friction, and the possibility of new partnerships and coalitions. We'll hear a little bit from Stephanie's interviewees in this episode and why she thinks changing our minds is such fertile ground for interesting conversations. Stephanie, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I wanted you to tell our listeners, what is Reckonings?
Yeah, so Reckonings comes from my own experience with campus activism, social change, social justice, and the question would always come up for me, am I changing anyone's mind? Am I actually moving anyone on climate change or minimum wage laws or whatever issue I happen to be focused on at the time, which of course, begs the question, how do people actually change their minds? And that question just became kind of a fascination of mine. And I started researching around and kind of keeping this extremely unscientific list of things that I thought radically transformed people, so falling in love, near-death experiences, psychedelics, sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes information, and that's, very rare because we usually only trust information that confirms what we already believe. But, so this exploration, I finally realized might be powerful to manifest in the form of stories, of people who have actually made these kinds of change as a podcast. And so a couple years ago, I launched Reckonings, which explores precisely this question of how people change. And I've had the great fortune of talking with people who've made, all kinds of transformative change. It sounds like listeners will hear a little bit of that, but just to give a little bit of a sense of the breadth, so a tough on crime prosecutor who developed an unlikely friendship with an inmate, which completely revolutionized his understanding of our criminal justice system, all the way to a deeply conservative congressman who made a dramatic and what he would call actually a spiritual conversion on climate change. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with Bob Inglis, all the way to a white supremacist who managed to transcend a life of hate and become an advocate for nonviolence. And so, so it's been a pretty motley crew of characters, a diverse cast of characters. But the through line is really just an exploration of this question. How do people change, and how do people change in ways that connect to or scale into broader social and political change?
It's a question that we think about quite a bit here at Breakthrough. I was telling you earlier that tell us about a time you changed your mind is literally an interview question that we ask applicants at the Breakthrough. Yeah, and it turns out to not just sort of reveal something about how they think about our issues, energy, food, conservation, but it really sort of reveals a depth of mind and a depth of thinking. As you say, these types of conversions are not at all limited to things like climate change or politics or anything like that. And the sort of ability to both sort of shift perspective, change minds, whatever, and really acknowledge it and see that it happened to you or experience it happening is actually, it's pretty rare in a life, pretty rare across sort of society, and it is fascinating.
Yeah. Yes, and the depth of mind, I often say I'm not just interested in a change in views. I'm interested in a change in the way we relate to our views. It's very much that kind of conscious conscious change, or just, being aware of yourself as you are evolving, in relationship with the world around you. So, yes. Yeah.
So I got introduced to you in one avenue through a mutual friend of ours, Danny Spitzberg, also via your excellent episode with Jerry Taylor, whom I know. Jerry works at the Niskanen Center. And had his own change of mind or heart or a combination about climate change. So I want to talk about that. But first, I want to play a bit of a clip from Stephanie's interview with Jerry.
One of the most useful witticisms that I've come across was from C.K. Chesterton, who cautioned against the person of the one book. The person who might read Atlas Shrugged or, name a book that is all of the political rage in certain communities, and then they become militant on this. And so Chesterton argued against the person who reads the one book because they will invariably find themselves in a well-lit prison cell, in a well-lit intellectual prison cell that they can't escape from. And when we find ourselves using our engines of motivated cognition to stay within the tribe and to constantly police ourselves against the possibility of being tempted by heretical thoughts and uncomfortable observations about reality. What we're really doing is arming our inner policemen to keep watch on this penitentiary that we voluntarily locked ourselves into. And one of the reasons why it's been an incredibly invigorating thing for me to be at the Niskanen Center and to have the people around me that I have around me is that it's an incredibly invigorating thing to not be in a penitentiary anymore, to not be in an ideological penitentiary or some sort of tribal penitentiary. And I fear that too many people, not just in climate skepticism and not just on the right, but on the left as well, because they are captured by these dogmatic and ideological loyalties, that they are, in a sense, locking themselves in a rather exhausting jail cell. And they would be far better to let these things go and to think with open minds.
All right, cool.
Cool. And just to give you a little more time with Stephanie and her guests, this is an episode that I found really fascinating as well with Joe Inslee, who used to work for Fox News CEO Roger Ailes.
At that point, I had never taken the time to examine why it was that Ailes said he had never met anyone more like him than me. All day, you can surround yourselves with your enemies, perceive they're real, and that keeps you occupied. Everything is an occasion for a crisis, a confrontation, an argument. We could have sat around and said, okay, we don't like Obama's policies. We think they're very bad. But instead, Obama, we thought he was evil and conniving and was going to become a tyrant who would never give up power. And it made us feel like heroes. It gave an importance to our lives. Everything was tinged by, the potential threats. Even when Ailes and his family and I were at the Olive Garden, which we enjoyed because it was all-you-can-eat breadsticks, we assumed that, Frank and Irma at the table next door might be listening to us, or might be assassins. My whole idea of journalism was couched in confrontation. Everything was a battle between, what we saw as good and what we saw as evil, because that's how we saw the whole world. I knew there was something missing. I knew that the course that Ailes and I were on was not, it seemed glorious, but deep down we knew that there was this isolation and sadness. That's part of the reason why, you make the president out to be, this sinister, figure out of a James Bond, story, because you can focus on that rather than on your own unhappiness. And so you fill your life with this extra drama and activity, so you don't have to think about or address the unhappiness. That sadness, it has a power over you when you don't address it and just acknowledge it. I realized that this is the deepest way how Ailes and I were most alike. I felt very close to God in that moment when I just yelled. While it might seem sort of sacrilegious, that was my soul being somehow forcing its way into honesty. The next step is that I have to write this story. I need to write this truthfully, unvarnished.
Cool. So, Stephanie, maybe starting with Jerry Taylor, what jumped out to you about your guest's experience and in this case, Jerry's experience, and why did you want to have this conversation?
Yeah, well, Jerry just has a really big delta. For him, it wasn't just that he was kind of, a climate skeptic or just, wasn't quite sure about climate change. He was a prominent spokesperson. He was a leading spokesperson for climate skepticism. He was that guy who waged battle against climate scientists, on the likes of CNN and NBC and Fox. And he's very articulate, and he was very effective in that role. And so just the leap, from that to where he is now. Now he's a very effective, also he's very articulate, so very effective and persuasive environmental activist and proponent of carbon tax legislation. So it was really kind of the enormity of his delta, of the leap that he made. And, as you hear in that clip, that's just kind of a perfect example of, not just a change in views, but a change in the way that we relate to our views. He really, he articulates that so beautifully, this shift from being from dogma to ideological liberty. I think he just did a beautiful, and this is something I learned only after, during the interview. This is something I didn't know about him before, but he just did a beautiful job of articulating exactly the kind of the shift I'm interested in, not just from right to left or left to right, but from being fearfully, attached to my views, to having the freedom to reflect on them and be critical of them and change them to adapt to the reality around me.
Yeah, it's something that I have hoped that Breakthrough cultivates. I know it's something that Niskanen, where Jerry works, cultivates, but it isn't just, as you were saying, a recognition of new information. There is a community aspect to this that I think was pretty relevant to Jerry as he was going through his transformation. The sort of people who are around you, the sort of how dogmatic or how open-minded or how partisan or how nonpartisan your community is, your literal group of friends and colleagues. And that can have as much or more of an effect on the sort of stasis of your perspective as how much information you're consuming.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yes, especially because our worldviews are intimately tied up with our identity, our community, the way we talk, the way we dress, what we have tattooed all over our bodies. And so really, changing, I've learned to say changing your mind is changing your life. And to the extent, but to your point, to the extent that we want to kind of maintain the capacity for critical self-reflection, it behooves us to surround ourselves with people who perhaps think differently from us, or engage in activities, whatever it is, that kind of keeps stretching us, keeps kind of challenging us to be critical of how we are, how we live, what we believe.
I like to think of this idea of like mega identity, where a lot of our opinions and beliefs about any number of subjects are much more determined by social pressures than sort of any particular set of ideological beliefs or sort of rationality as commonly defined. So like the way I think about it is that like what you think on gun control might be very correlated with what you think about Colin Kaepernick, even though those two things don't necessarily have anything to do with each other right off the bat. And we get pushed into these sort of belief systems based on social pressures.
Totally.
And I feel like that is very common with climate change. And not only is Jerry's case really interesting just from his personal story perspective, but he and other people, you talked about Bob Inglis, but he has really opened up this new community and this new space to sort of not be from traditional sort of environmental communities, traditional environmentalist communities, or not be from the sort of climate left, but still care deeply about climate change. And the more of those sort of diverse communities exist, the easier it is for us to not only sort of go through these transformations where they're necessary, but also to sort of talk across those ideological differences.
Totally. What you call mega identity, I love that. I didn't know what I've been kind of calling it like bundled identity. It's kind of like this ecosystem of like beliefs that kind of go together, and it's like all or nothing. It's like a package. And I feel like, it's so easy to get pushed into one of these like bundled deals where it's like, you believe in this, well, therefore you believe in that and that and that. And when there are people like Bob Inglis or Jerry Taylor who kind of, it's like, well, actually I can pick and choose, I am my own independent person who can be both conservative, deeply conservative, and, pro taking strong action on climate change. It's helpful modeling for the rest of us to remember that it's just because you believe in A doesn't mean you need to believe in B, C, the whole package, the whole mega identity. We can pick and choose what fits our own values, what fits our own moral compass.
Tell me about Joe Inslee, the ex-Fox News guy.
Yeah, Joe. So Joe is an interesting case. So he, and I guess I'm realizing perhaps listeners didn't have, I'm going to give a tiny bit of context on the clip in retrospect maybe, but basically where that clip was coming from was that Roger took Joe under his wing and really mentored him, and, for a while, Joe actually lived with Roger and his wife, Elizabeth. And at the peak of their relationship, Roger Ailes considered Joe to be like a son to him. And eventually, Joe had a reckoning and made a dramatic departure from his relationship with Roger Ailes. But so Joe ended up being, for me, and I talked to him for about 6 hours, this kind of incredible window into the motivations and desires and psychology that drive Fox News, and into what it can take to shift that psychology. And kind of the I guess retroactive context for the clip is that early on in their relationship, Roger had told Joe's dad that he'd never met anyone more like him than Joe. And Joe had never really understood why that was. And so that was Joe kind of looking back and reflecting on why Roger said he'd never met anyone more like him than Joe. But yeah, Joe just ends up, I feel like a question I ask myself is like, what is going inside? What is going on inside of Fox News? What is going on inside of the minds of people who work there and produce what they produce and the way that they produce it. And so Joe, suddenly it actually starts to make sense once you get into his mind. And, he talks about these dinners that they would have like Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly and Joe and, whoever else was, and really believing that, like he says in the clip, that, Obama was a tyrant and was never going to give up power. And he was working with the TSA to take over and so we can look at those things from the outside and say that's nuts. But once you get inside of it and, talking to Joe for hours, like if that's actually what you believe, then it makes sense that it would drive them to do the kinds of things that they do.
Yeah, very much. I wonder, you sort of mentioned at the top different things that sort of spur people towards a reckoning. You mentioned falling in love. You mentioned near-death experiences. I wonder for folks reflecting on their change of mind, their reckoning after the fact, what are the sort of the common observations you've made about what they say they went through?
Yeah, so, there's kind of, smaller, I guess, lessons I've learned of, this may sound obvious, but one thing, this applies very much to Joe, one thing that doesn't move people to change is telling them to change.
Right.
Because for the most part, people believe in the integrity of whatever it is that they're doing, and they're doing whatever they're doing for reasons that we can all probably relate to, because they're seeking love or belonging or purpose or self-actualization. And so, oftentimes we have to actually understand why people are doing whatever it is that they're doing if we want to kind of open up some space for change and growth. But as far as, I guess the overarching observation I have made is that, these things, falling in love, near-death experiences, psychedelics, it's not necessarily that those things, make us change. What those things have in common, or what those things and things like that do, is that they reveal to us the difference between who we think we are and who we actually are, or the difference between the impact we think we're having on the world and the impact we're actually having on the world. And it's seeing that difference. It's wrestling with that gap. That is what I've seen initiates the process of transformation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The term we use around here for it is cognitive dissonance. It's not telling somebody that they're wrong and that they have to change their ways. It's just sort of opening up the sort of conversation set to new ways of thinking about a given problem. So, you might sort of feel one way about nuclear power because you associate it with nuclear bombs and with the sort of like military industrial complex. But you might feel differently if you associate it with sort of very anti-fossil fuel movements in France and Sweden and things like that. And the sort of associations that we make are the things that really either sort of lock us in to a given way of looking at a thing or a technology or a person. And then when those associations are shaken up, that sort of friction is it kind of goes in two directions, doesn't it, I guess? Like either it does, as you say, depending on sort of how it's presented or how it's consumed, it can sort of cause backlash and sort of further lock us in to our
doubling
perspective.
Down.
That friction is a negative space to be. We don't like cognitive dissonance,
and we're
but it
going
is
to deal
also
with it somehow. Yeah.
Right. So I don't know. Like, is there are there like better and worse ways for a person to navigate through that, or for like me to help someone navigate through that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two things I can say about that. I mean, and I'm not an expert. I'm not a social scientist, but one in Bob Inglis's story, he really makes a point that the kind of like a pivotal moment in his story is when his son asked him, I forget exactly how he said it, but said something like, I want to vote for you, Dad, but I want you to do better. I don't remember exactly how he said it, but Bob's point was that his son was not threatening him. His son was basically saying, I love you and I expect more from you. Like, I believe in you to be better. And that's an enormous difference, whether we're coming at someone from a place of judgment and, castigation versus from a place of actually believing in them to be their best selves. Are you familiar with the LGBT Center's Leadership Lab in LA?
I may have heard of it, but
You
clearly
might
not
have heard
enough.
of This American Life did an episode about them so this is an amazing story and a response to your question. So after Prop 8 lost, gay marriage lost in California, the LGBT Center in LA, everyone, there was this reckoning. How did we lose? And so they decided to go and canvass and ask people who voted against gay marriage and ask them why they voted against it. And it was kind of this whole project of, they were kind of trying to convince people and maybe like shame them into like, how could you, and that obviously wasn't working at all. And what they learned worked was they would just ask people open-ended questions about their lives. And so they, knock on someone's doors. Hi, what did, voted against gay marriage. Okay. So, are you married? And the person's like, yeah. So tell me about your marriage. It's like, oh, well, I love my wife. I've been married to her for 25 years. We have an amazing relationship, da, da, da. It's like, oh, okay. Do you know anyone who's gay? And the person's like, oh, yeah, my cousin's gay. It's like, oh, well, tell me about your cousin. It's like, oh, well, I love my cousin. We do Thanksgiving with him every year. He gives my kids piggyback rides. He's amazing. It's like, oh, does your cousin know how you voted on gay marriage? It's like, well, no. It's like, well, what do you think your cousin would think? It's like, well, actually, it's like, do I really want to deprive my cousin of this amazing partnership I've been able to have with my wife? And like, they have this on video, by the way. And it's just this amazing thing to watch people just completely come to it on their own, just by being asked open-ended questions about their life. And that's just this like hopeful way to see humanity. It's like we have it within us. So I guess just back to your original question, it's like, I don't know if it's like a trick or a hack, but certainly coming at people not with judgment, but coming at people from a belief that they have it within them.
No, and it gets to your original point that sort of asking people to tell their story is a lot more interesting or effective, not necessarily at changing people's mind. That doesn't have to be the goal, but just at understanding their perspective and understanding their motivation.
Yeah.
It's not sort of as effective to ask them to check a box, left, right, yes, no on this issue. I mean, it's funny you tell that story. A couple years ago, at one of our events, we hosted a discussion which we called "What Can Green Learn from Pink," where we had a couple funders who were strong backers of the marriage equality campaign in California and in the rest of the country, and who are all now also big backers of push for climate action and environmental action. And the sort of question that they wanted to pose on the panel and to the audience was this was just a couple years ago, well into universal marriage equality in this country, and they asked that exact thing. Sort of, what did we get right? What can environmentalists learn from this? The way that I heard it is sort of very analogous to the story you just told. What they said roughly was that the sort of initial strategy was focusing on the legality and legal equality and sort of equal opportunity under the law, and that led to things like the passage of Prop 8 in 2008. And what worked better was sort of drawing people's attention to, we all have friends and family who are LGBTQ, and not recognizing some sort of like technical legal reasoning, but a reasoning based in community and actually love. That worked much better. And so our sort of question was sort of, how does that port over to environmental politics? It certainly suggests that we shouldn't be shaming people for their behavior or for their beliefs as much as I think some environmentalists do. Obviously, there are limitations to the analogy. Marriage equality wasn't trying to create this like $50 trillion infrastructure change where there are vested interests and infrastructural lock-in and things like that. But it is like a culture. It is a very, I think, instructive cultural moment that is really worth reflecting on. Sort of one of the most rapid forces of cultural change that we've ever seen in American history.
Yeah. Yes. You mean the shift in public opinion on gay marriage?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a like a beautiful, a perfect case study in broader shift in views. Yeah.
So if information, as you say, pretty rarely is the thing to cause people to change their mind, then sort of what do we do with all this? I mean, I do believe there's value in sort of working through challenging disagreements with friends and family. I think there's tremendous value in your podcast, for instance. I hope you keep doing it for a long
Thank
time.
you.
What does is there like sort of a social practice that we should be inculcating like among like primary school students? Are there policies? Like one thing that jumps out is like I think the world is better with more like Niskanen centers, like places with sort of heterodox thinking, like Jerry Taylor and his colleagues are putting together there. Like what else like do you think we can be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I operate on the more cultural side of things, so I think we can both model the behavior, I guess, more. I guess I would look to our public leaders to model the behavior, but our cultural response is a part of it. We are such a punitive culture. The second, someone admits they made a mistake or they change their mind, they're kind of hounded, and
Right.
Called a flip flopper. And so, I think part of it is just making more cultural room for ourselves to learn, for ourselves to grow, for ourselves to change. And part of that, yeah, is it's. I think there's a leadership opportunity for public leaders to just step in and say, yeah, I did that, and I really take responsibility for it, and I've learned in these ways, and this is what I've done to make amends and to repair the harm that I've caused, and this is how I'm growing. I think there's room there, especially in this Me Too moment. I mean, there's a leadership opportunity here for our public figures to model what it looks like, to engage in critical self-reflection, and I think there's room on, I guess, for us, us the culture, or us the society, to actually allow them to do that, to make enough space for them to do that. So that's. What does that mean that we teach in schools? I mean, I guess there's a question, and a question that we can kind of leave out there for listeners is, how do we engage in critical self-reflection? What are our practices for doing that? It used to be historically that happened within the context, I think, of religion, of a confession booth, or, for people who practice Judaism, of Yom Kippur, there are rituals, there are practices. But if you don't, if that's not what you're up to, where is the space where we practice critical self-reflection?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. One thing that jumped out to me from what you just said was this sort of punitive culture that we do live in. The flip flopper thing I find really fascinating. There's this very sort of persuasive push in American politics to, everyone should believe what I believe. But then when people change their minds, then we call them a flip-flopper.
Yeah.
And I guess, what is the point of trying to persuade people to our side if we're not going to trust them when they've changed their mind, if we're going to find them sort of inherently flip-floppery? It's this catch-22 where you're sort of not surprised, but that there isn't more sort of dialogue and persuasion happening.
Right. Well, and not all change is created equal. Not all shifts are created equal. Sometimes it's because, and actually shifts on gay marriage is a perfect example of that. It's like how many of these public figure or our representatives, whether it's Hillary Clinton, Obama, anyone, how many of them believed in gay marriage before they were willing to come out publicly in support of it? So, but, and they only did so when it was politically safe. But
Right.
I think part of that, again, is us, can we make it more safe, to the point you just made, can we make it more safe for people to actually, stand up for what they believe in?
Right. I mean, maybe it's being naive or looking for a silver lining, but one of the things that I'm at least a little hopeful for in what I see as a pretty big political realignment happening with Trump and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie and Kamala and like the whole thing is being shaken up, at a systems level, is that it will sort of create more space for this friction between ideas, between perspectives, as things like industrial policy come back into vogue and neoliberalism leave vogue, and like the way that we think about our social ties and our social groups is being shaken up, the way that we think about sort of where we live is being shaken up. It's causing quite a bit of disturbance and quite a bit of scary things. But like we were talking about, like that, I think it does introduce some hopefully productive friction as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually have seen more examples among the younger, or like the freshman class, AOC and I can't remember the Rashida Tlaib and the other woman who were just kind of called out for their views on Israel. I've seen more of a willingness to just admit mistakes and move on. Admit mistakes, and whatever the calculus was for that, I don't know, but I want to assume that there's maybe an emerging willingness or capacity to just learn and grow in public.
Yeah, I've been. I hear that. I've been pretty refreshed with AOC at least once. Basically, sort of admitting in an interview, I'm learning on the job, and this is new for me. The only difference between me and the folks who came before me are that I'm willing to admit it.
Totally. Yes. Yeah, because that's who we're hiring, or that's who we're electing, is someone who's gonna. It's not baked. It's never done being baked. It's whoever we're hiring or electing. It's someone who can evolve with us, grow with us. So yeah, I thought that was great too.
Well, with that, Stephanie, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcasts. As I said at the top of this episode, this is the final episode of our second season, taking place a little over a year after we launched this podcast, and we are just so grateful for everyone who continues to listen. This is still something of an experiment around Breakthrough, but we at least know that we want to keep it going, so please send your feedback, send your suggestions, send your complaints, or whatever. You can reach me at alex@thebreakthrough.org, alex@thebreakthrough.org. As I said, we're going to take a few weeks off, but we'll be back soon with the first episode of our third season, which will hopefully include some new guests and ideas inspired by you, our audience. With that, I want to again thank my guest Stephanie and our producers Alyssa Kadaman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.